A starving girl walked miles barefoot. What she found at the ranch gate changed her life forever. The sun burned mercilessly overhead, its heat pressing down on the barren land like a heavy hand. Dust swirled with every faint gust of wind, stinging Elena's skin and filling her throat with dryness. Her bare feet were cracked and blistered from the unforgiving dirt road, yet she kept moving one shaky step after another. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, sharper than the stones cutting into her soles. She had not eaten in 2 days, not since she'd slipped away in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back. Behind her, the world she had run from felt like a shadow she could never escape. Her relatives had promised her shelter after her parents died, but their kindness had quickly twisted into cruelty. They had treated her less like family and more like a servant, taking her labor and giving little in return. When the blows and insults grew heavier than she could bear, Elena gathered her courage and fled. She had thought freedom would feel lighter. Instead, it weighed on her shoulders, heavy with hunger, fear, and uncertainty. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a wavering line under the cruel sun. The horizon danced with mirages, pools of water that did not exist, promises of relief that vanished the closer she came. Her lips were cracked, her voice a whisper when she tried to pray for strength. Each step felt like defiance, as though with every move forward she was proving that she was still alive, still unwilling to be broken. A sudden wind carried dust into her eyes, forcing her to stop and shield her face with trembling hands. The storm of grit blinded her for a moment, but even through the sting she refused to turn back. Somewhere ahead, she told herself, there had to be food, water, maybe even someone who would see her not as a burden, but as a human being worth saving. Until then, she would keep walking barefoot and alone on the hungry road. The ranch lay quiet beneath the wide stretch of sky, its fences leaning with age and its barns weathered by years of wind and storm. Caleb sat on the porch, a chipped mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, watching the fields that once thrived now lie parched and stubborn. The cattle had grown thinner, the crops fewer, and every sunrise brought the same question. How much longer could he keep this place alive? Caleb was a man carved from the land itself, broad-shouldered, sunburnt, and hardened by years of work. Yet beneath his rugged frame was a weariness he carried like an invisible saddle. His wife had died 3 winters ago, taken by an illness the doctors couldn't fight, and the emptiness of her absence had never left the cabin. Before that, he had buried his mother on the same soil, the woman who had taught him to ride, rope, and fight for this ranch with everything in him. Loss had become a familiar companion, and it had carved deep lines into his face. Most days, Caleb spoke to no one but the horses and the cattle. His routine was simple. Wake before dawn, mend fences, feed livestock, ride the boundaries, count what Lily still owned. Then at dusk, he would return to the cabin, eat in silence, and sit with ghosts that never answered back. The world beyond his land had grown distant. The neighbors visited less. The bank sent letters he didn't bother to open anymore, and travelers passed by without stopping. He had grown used to it. People come and go, he muttered more than once to himself. But no one stays. It had become his rule, his shield against disappointment. He kept his distance from strangers, refused kindness he couldn't repay, and closed his doors before anyone could ask to enter. The ranch was his burden, his only family now, and if it broke him, then so be it. Caleb had decided long ago he would face the silence alone. By the time Elena stumbled up the dirt path that led to the ranch house, her legs felt like brittle sticks ready to snap. The wooden gate loomed ahead, its hinges rusted, its paint long faded, but to her it looked like the doorway to salvation. She clutched the worn post for balance, breathing hard, her vision blurring at the edges. With the last ounce of strength she had, she tried to call out, but only a rasp escaped her throat. Then her knees gave way, and she crumpled to the ground, dust rising around her like a shroud. From the porch, Caleb had been watching the horizon the way he always did, expecting nothing, waiting for no one. When he saw the figure stagger at his gate, his first thought was that trouble had found him again. Strangers had come before, asking for handouts or looking for ways to cheat a lonely rancher. His jaw tightened as he stood, suspicion coiling in his chest. But when he walked closer and saw the girl, lying in the dirt, barefoot, her feet torn and her face hollow with hunger, Something in him shifted. Kneeling beside her, Caleb touched her shoulder and felt how frail she was, like a bird that had flown too far. Her lips moved, whispering something about bread, before her eyes rolled back in exhaustion. For a long moment, he stood there, torn between mistrust and pity. But then he saw her hands, raw, scraped, trembling as if they had carried the weight of miles, and he sighed. This was no trick. This was survival. Lifting her carefully, Caleb carried her into the cabin, laying her on the old couch by the hearth. He fetched water, then went to the pantry where the shelves were nearly bare. From a tin, he pulled out the last loaf of bread he had, rough but enough. When she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, he placed it in her hands. And when she tried to rise, ashamed to take it, he set an old pair of boots at her feet and said in a low, steady voice, "Eat, and put these on. No one should walk this land barefoot." When Elena awoke, the room smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh hay drifting in from the barn outside. The coarse blanket around her was rough but warm, and on the table nearby sat the half loaf of bread she hadn't been able to finish the night before. Slowly, she sat up, her sore muscles protesting, yet her spirit steadier than it had been in days. Caleb sat across the room in a worn chair, polishing his boots with a rag, his face as unreadable as stone. She cleared her throat softly. "Thank you," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "For the bread, for the boots, for not leaving me out there." Her eyes lowered, but only for a moment. Then she met his gaze again with quiet determination. "But don't mistake me. I didn't come here for pity. Muy bias ek chance chahi. Kam karn ka. Apni peon parkada hon ka. Main apka asan lina chadi hoon. Beek nahi." For a long heartbeat, Caleb said nothing. He was used to people begging, demanding, or trying to take more than they gave. But this girl, fragile as she looked, carried a fire in her eyes that reminded him of someone who refused to be broken. Slowly, he set the rag aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Not many ask for a chance instead of charity," he murmured. "That says something." Elena straightened, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but she did not back down. "I can clean, cook, tend animals, whatever you need. Just let me earn what I take." Her words held more pride than desperation. Caleb studied her for a while, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken test. At last, he gave a short nod. "We'll see what you can do," he said simply. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was enough to build the first fragile thread of trust between them. The next morning, Elena rose before the sun, determined to prove her words from a night before. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and stepped outside into the crisp dawn air. Without waiting for instructions, she began fetching water, sweeping the porch and checking on the chickens. Her hands were blistered and raw, but she worked with quiet purpose. Every chore a way to reclaim her dignity. Caleb watched from a distance, half expecting her to quit before noon, but she didn't. Hour after hour, she pushed herself, even humming softly while she worked. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel so silent. By midday, when she awkwardly tried to wrestle a stubborn goat back into its pen, Caleb let out a small chuckle. The sound startled him as much as it did her. He hadn't laughed, not really, since his wife had passed. Elena looked at him curiously, and for a brief moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. It was as though her stubborn spirit had cracked something open in him. That evening, they shared a simple meal of beans and bread at the old wooden table. For the first time, conversation replaced silence. Elena spoke of her past, the home she had run from, the hunger and loneliness that had nearly broken her spirit. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady, as if telling her story gave her strength. Caleb listened, nodding slowly, then shared his own wounds, the sickness that had taken his wife, the mother he had buried on this land, and the way loss had turned his heart to stone. There was no pity in the exchange, only recognition. Two souls who had walked through pain, sitting together in the glow of a flickering lantern, finding a strange comfort in each other's truths. And as the night deepened, Caleb realized he was no longer speaking to a stranger. Elena was becoming something else, someone who understood the silence he lived in, someone who might just fill it. It was near sundown when the sound of hooves echoed down the dirt road. Caleb stepped out to the porch, his hand instinctively brushing against the old rifle leaning by the door. A cloud of dust rose behind two riders approaching fast. Elena, who had been gathering firewood by the barn, froze the moment she saw them. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with the kind of fear Caleb hadn't seen before. She didn't need to say their names. He understood immediately. Her past had found her. The men dismounted roughly, one of them calling out Elena's name with mocking tone. "Girl, you thought you could run forever?" The voice carried cruelty, familiar enough to make her knees weaken. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between them and Elena, his shoulders squared like a wall of iron. "This is my land," he said coldly. "You've got no business here." The men sneered, but one glance at the rifle resting by the door made them hesitate. Still, Elena's hands trembled. Memories of nights filled with insults, of being treated like property rather than blood, came flooding back. Her heart pounded, not just with fear for herself, but for Caleb. She knew men like her uncle. They would come back, angrier, and Caleb didn't deserve that danger. That night, long after the riders retreated with threats hanging in the air, she sat by the hearth with tears streaking her dust-stained face. When Caleb tried to reassure her, Elena shook her head fiercely. "I can't stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Main tum or problem may nai dalsakti. Tum already zayada riskly a high. Agar main rucky, to tumbiunk gus kanashana ban joj." Her words cut through the small cabin like a blade. For Caleb, it was the first time he realized she might slip away. Not because she didn't want shelter, but because she feared losing him to the shadows that followed her. The next evening, the riders returned, this time with more menace in their eyes. The crunch of their boots on Caleb's porch echoed like a warning bell. Elena stood frozen near the doorway, her breath shallow, every instinct telling her to run. But before she could take a step, Caleb moved past her, planted himself firmly on the wooden steps, his rifle steady in his grip. The fading sun painted him in gold and shadow, a lone figure refusing to bend. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice like steel. "Not tonight. Not ever again." One of the men spat on the ground, snarling. "She's ours. She belongs to family, not to some stranger." At that, Caleb's eyes darkened, and he took a step forward, his stance unshakable. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he growled. "Stay. Not because you need shelter," he turned briefly toward Elena, his gaze softening, "but because I need you here." The words hit harder than the rifle in his hands. For Elena, it was the first time someone had claimed her not out of control or pity, but out of love. And as the riders cursed and finally retreated into the night, the choice became clear. Elena could keep running forever, or she could stay, and for the first time, truly belong. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Elena was no longer just a guest within the ranch's weathered walls. She became a part of it, her laughter blending with the creak of the barn doors and the neigh of the horses. From sunrise to sunset, she worked beside Caleb, feeding the livestock, patching broken fences, even planting a small garden behind the cabin. Where the ranch had once felt like a prison of silence, her presence filled it with life. Caleb, who had grown used to long days of bitterness, now found himself watching her with quiet admiration as she turned chores into something almost joyful. Together, they began to rebuild not only the land but themselves. Caleb taught Elena how to mend saddles and handle the stubborn cattle, while she showed him how to stretch supplies, repair old clothes, and make even the simplest meals feel like home. Slowly, the ranch began to change. The cattle grew stronger, the fields greener, and the cabin warmer. Word spread among the nearby villagers, who noticed that the once grim rancher now spoke with a softer voice, carried himself with renewed purpose, and even allowed a rare smile to break across his face. For the first time in years, Caleb wasn't just surviving, he was living, and it was all because of the girl who had once arrived barefoot and starving at his gate. The summer wind carried the scent of tilled earth and wildflowers across the ranch, but for Elena, the real change was in her heart. Weeks had passed since Caleb had stood against her past, and each day since, she had seen more of the man beneath the hardened shell. He was still quiet, still stubborn, but there was kindness in the way he handed her tools, in the way he made sure she never worked too long without water, and in the way his gaze lingered when she laughed. Slowly, the wall she had built inside herself began to crumble, replaced by something she had not felt in years: trust. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb returned from town carrying a small bundle. He set it before her with a rare, almost shy smile. Inside was a brand-new pair of boots, sturdy leather stitched with care. Elena blinked, her throat tightening as he placed them at her feet. "Now you'll never walk barefoot again," he said softly. The words carried more than just a promise of comfort. They carried the weight of his heart. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. And in that moment, she understood this wasn't pity, it was love. Rising, she slipped into the boots, then into his arms, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I'll stay, not because I need shelter, but because I need you." And under the vast, dusty sky, they finally chose each other. The ranch, once weighed down by silence and despair, had transformed into something alive. The fences stood straighter, the fields greener, and the cattle healthier, but the truest change lay within the cabin walls. Where loneliness had echoed, now laughter warmed the air. Elena's touch could be seen everywhere, from the blooming garden behind the house to the neatly kept shelves inside. What had once been a place of survival had grown into a home, built not only of timber and stone, but of trust, healing, and love. Caleb no longer carried the ranch as a burden alone. Together, they carried it as a promise of a shared future. On the morning of the first harvest, as the horizon glowed with the soft hues of dawn, Caleb and Elena sat side by side on the porch swing. The world before them was quiet, kissed by golden light, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stilled. Elena leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder, her new boots resting firmly on the porch boards. The man who had once sworn no one would ever stay, and the girl who had once walked barefoot and starving, now sat bound by a love stronger than any hardship. And as the sun rose, painting their faces in hope, the truth became clear. She had come barefoot and broken, but now she stood strong, loved, and never alone.